Great, bienvenue, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for this exciting journey into the mysteries of the underwater caves of the Ottawa River. Many, if not all of us, are joining from within the Ottawa River watershed, which is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And even if you are not within this watershed and within this territory, it's important to acknowledge the long history of Indigenous peoples in stewarding water protection and biodiversity. And so let's take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing work of stewardship of water by Indigenous peoples. J'aimerais vous faire savoir que le webinaire aujourd'hui se déroulera principalement en anglais. Mais nous sommes un organisme bilingue, donc vous pouvez poser des questions en français ou nous envoyer un courriel après le webinaire pour demander une clarification. So I want to let you know that today's webinar will be taking place primarily in English. But as a bilingual organization, we are happy to answer questions asked in French and to provide any additional clarification by sending us an email afterwards. And one last piece of housekeeping, there will be a little bit of time, hopefully at the end of the session, for a Q&A. So if you have a question that comes up during the presentation, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom screen to ask a question to the presenters. I know there's a jam-packed presentation, so we'll see if there's time at the end, and even if not, we'll find a way to get those questions to the presenters. So feel free to submit those questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll circle back to them. So my name is Laura Rainsborough, and I'm the Ottawa Riverkeeper and CEO here at Ottawa Riverkeeper. It's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar today, as we have some really fantastic speakers coming up. But first, I want to invite you to stay in touch with Ottawa Riverkeeper. This is one among many webinars and other events that we share in our newsletter. If you're interested in staying in touch, please do sign up for the newsletter. We'll put the link in the chat now so you can join up even right now. And also you're invited to follow us on social media. So we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can find out more about all of our projects, our advocacy work, our education programs, and the science-based monitoring that we do of the Ottawa River watershed. So today on this presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce an Ottawa Riverkeeper champion. He has given more than one webinar with Ottawa Riverkeeper, and we're so delighted to have him back, Dr. André Martel of the Canadian Museum of Nature. He has a history of collaborating with Ottawa Riverkeeper, including on our joint project looking at the populations of the hickory nut, an endangered freshwater mussel species in the Ottawa River. And joining Dr. Martel today is Jill Heinerth, explorer in residence for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, an expert diver, and the author of Into the Planet. So with that, I will hand it over to our speakers. I know they have a lot to share with us today, and there's quite a big audience excited to hear from them. So André and Jill, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Laura. I think you can hear me well. Well, today is an opportunity to share with a general public audience some really exciting findings that Jill and I have more or less put together following this collaboration, which is quite novel. We are teaming up an amazing cave diver, Jill Heinerth, with our team here of biologists, myself leading a number of colleagues at the museum and also in other institutions to study the freshwater mussels and fishes of the Ottawa River and the occurrence, the presence of these underwater caves in the Ottawa Valley is largely unknown by most people. Even myself, I did not hear about that until the mid-90s when the diver who mapped them, David Sawatsky, gave a presentation at the museum in 1996. In fact, it was past that. It was past 1996. That being said, these caves are unique, dangerous, but full of life. And my colleague Jill Heinerth is, I'm gonna here try to, here you see Jill diving in a cave, and that's not what I'm trained to do. I'm an open water scuba diver, but Jill is trained to something else. She is a cave diver, has dove in all sorts of caves around the world. She is an author, and I've got a book here. And if you go to her website, she's an avid writer. She writes about her career. She is also an artist. And diving with Jill, and I've done that a few times, but not in caves, is extraordinary because of her mastery of the technique of diving. So she is truly an amazing photographer, video maker, filmmaker, and the first explorer in residence of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. So what a team we're making when we have Jill to explore the caves of the Ottawa River. Here is Jill entering one of those caves of the Ottawa. You can see how murky the water is. This is a dangerous place to go. I'm not trained for that, but basically Jill is the eyes of the scientist. For this talk, we're going to talk about two main animal groups, mussels and fishes. And you might say, why studying those caves? Well, it's because we have all the evidence from the dives done by previous divers, David Sawatsky included, who mapped the caves for about a 15-year period, and Jill, who focused specifically on the biology of the caves, starting several years ago with my team. And we have evidence that the community of mussels and fishes inside the cave is unique. Unique in the sense of living in darkness, and unique in the sense that there are no other caves like this on the planet that we have discovered so far. And these caves are extension of the Ottawa River under the mainland, under the islands, where it's dark and the river passes through, and the flow is dangerous, and yet inside live many creatures. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Very quickly, the Ottawa River watershed, here you've got it in gray, you recognize Georgian Bay, Huron-Lac Huron. It's an enormous watershed, and we're talking about, 1.7 times the area of Lake Superior. The flow is enormous in the spring in terms of cubic meter per second. 21 species of freshwater mussels, of native freshwater mussels, which represents 33% plus of all of Canada's native freshwater mussel species, are found in the Ottawa River watershed, and 58 species of freshwater fishes are in our watershed. These are rather stunning numbers. So it's a diverse freshwater community that lives in the Ottawa River. Now, it's easy to be excited about fishes. Here's Tim Haxton, a colleague of ours at the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, handling a large sturgeon collected near Fitzroy, downstream of the Chatfall Dam. Sturgeon are spectacular, so are large bass. But how about mussels? Well, why would you study mussels? What's so exciting about the group? They all look similar, do they? Why don't we have a close look? And I'll try to convince you that there are so many species out there if you pay attention to the morphology, the shape, the colors, and their biology is extraordinary. And they're linked to fishes. And that's what I'm trying to leave as a message, that the connection fish-mussel is a key to how wonderful this kind of project, multidisciplinary project, really is about. Here you have different shapes, different colors, which basically represent different species. Hold on a second. Have we lost?
I think just double click on your slide again.
Yes.
Yeah. And then slideshow start.
Slideshow.
From current slide.
Okay, I see a few icons on the top, but if the people see well the screen, that's good enough. So basically, mussels. Here are, by the way, some names of mussels you find in the Ottawa River. Laura, in the introduction, mentioned the hickory nut mussel. Here it is on the left. And even though it's an endangered species, in the Ottawa River, there are a lot of these mussels present near the caves and in the upper Ottawa, and also other species, the plain pocketbook mussel, the fat market mussel, the triangle floater mussel, eastern elliptio, and on and on. So one thing I want to make sure is that people distinguish between the native freshwater mussels and the marine mussels. So the mussels that you eat at the restaurant, somewhere in the center, the darker one, we're not talking about that. We're not talking also about the zebra mussel in this particular talk, except maybe one slide to tell you about that as a potential stressor. We're really talking about those large mussels that people see when they canoe at the lake, at the river, the native mussels, and there are 55 different species in the country. This is what my camera, a good Nikon underwater camera with a good macro lens can see. There are not only beautiful shells out there when you pay attention to colors and details and shapes, there are also beautiful siphons or apertures where the water is coming in and out, filtered by the mussel through the gills. Each mussel has its own color signature. And if you have some experience with time, you don't even touch the mussel. You can identify many of these species by just looking at the siphons. What can a mussel do to our ecosystem? Think about it. A single mussel can filter 1 to 2 liters of water a day through its gills, capturing coliform bacteria, plankton. That is thousands of liters per year per mussel. Imagine when you have millions of mussels in your lake or river. And that's the case of the Ottawa. There are tens, if not hundreds of millions of freshwater mussels scattered across the system. Truly, when you think that they live decades, some of them can live over a century old. Truly, they are an amazing treasure in our rivers and lakes. On the right-hand side, you can see another ecosystem service, if you want, if you wish, that the native freshwater mussels can provide to our rivers and lakes. That is the mixing or oxygenation of the sediment of the lake or of the river. Call that the earthworm effect. I like the term. I've used it in many public talks. The earthworm effect is the mixing of the sediment by the foot of the mussel as they plow through the sand or the mud or the silt or the gravel, if they can, when it's not too compact substrate. And that oxygenates the bottom and enhances, most probably, the local biodiversity on the surface water interface. They're, of course, the food of a number of wildlife species, muskrat to speak of, to just as an example. But what I think is the most extraordinary component of their biology is the mussel-fish connection, or their dependency on fishes, local freshwater fishes like minnows, trout, bass, sturgeon. You'll see in a moment examples of other species of mussels and fishes, whereby the fish is necessary for the freshwater mussel, for its embryos or larvae, call them glochidia, for its larvae to, at some point in time during the year, and the time varies among species, to attach either on the fins or the gills. In this case, so you can see here, if I go back once, the larvae of this mussel here, once the male has fertilized the female via filter feeding, the larvae here are microscopic, 0.3 millimeter. You can see how tiny it is. They will attach, in the case of this particular mussel, on the fins of the fish. And it could be a minnow, it could be a stickerback, it could be a bass. In the case of this freshwater mussel, the floater mussel, often they are minnows or cyprinids. And the embryo or larva will stay on the fish for many weeks, sometimes months, sometimes even in the winter under the ice. This happens and lasts for a long time, before dropping off at the right time of the year, metamorphosed into a baby mussel. It's an amazing life cycle. And for those species of mussels, like the pearl shell mussel, the hickory knot, the elliptio, it will be this kind of system where the larva must attach on the gill filaments, not the fins, but the gill filaments of the host fish in order to complete their metamorphosis, become a true metamorphosed juvenile mussel, dropping off on the bottom, often disappearing. They're out of sight for 1 or 2 years before resurfacing as tiny juvenile mussel, starting the adult lifestyle. It's an amazing life cycle. All our freshwater mussels, including the Australian species, the European species of freshwater mussels, they do the same thing. They require fishes to complete their life cycle. In red here, Elliptio, Lampsilis, Obovaria, remember those names. These are species of mussels or genera of mussels whereby the Glochidia or embryos or larvae must attach on the gills of the fish. And here's a nice sketch that Jill's put together. Imagine this, you've got a female Lampsilis cardium or plain pocketbook, common in the Ottawa River, and the male nearby. The male would release the sperm as the female filter feeds the water, the plankton and breathes through the gills. The sperm enters the females, fertilizing the eggs, which are kept into brooding pouches, kept in the female. The larvae are staying in the female until, in the case of this particular species, the female mussel has evolved a kind of a lure whereby the bass, in this case, a predatory fish, thinks it's a prey and will come and try to take a bite at it. And literally at that time, the female will squirt hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of tiny Glochidia entering the mouth of the fish and attaching to where? To the gills of the bass. And that's how a lamp mussel will be able to, quote, enhance its reproductive success by attracting the fish with the lure. It's an extraordinary life cycle. It's an extraordinary behavior. And here they are, after being on the gills for X number of weeks or months, they'll drop off as juvenile mussel. Truly, our freshwater mussels, one of the messages I'd like to leave with you guys, with people looking at, listening to this talk, mussels are great indicators of water quality, of ecosystem health, and it's in part because of their connection with fishes. When you have at your lake or at your river, at your cottage, along the Ottawa, when you have a large population, a diverse population of freshwater mussels, that's good news. It means the water is rather healthy, the quality is good, the ecosystem is healthy, there are fishes out there, and things are going rather well. So the region of interest for this talk, the Westmeath area, it's about a 100-kilometer upstream of Ottawa. It is in that area that in 2014, we discovered a large population of the species that Laura mentioned earlier, the hickory knot. It's an endangered species in Canada, but the hickory knot is widespread. In fact, it's a great news. It's in abundance in many areas of the Ottawa River, which is a surprising find in the sense that in the Great Lakes, it's mostly extirpated, thanks to the zebra mussels. In the St. Lawrence, it's going well in some areas, but here in the Ottawa Valley, the hickory knot is present and quite well represented. Healthy population. So we discovered an amazing population right here, in the Lac Coulonge Reach, near the Finlay Islands, which is next to Westmeath. Westmeath, the town of Westmeath is here. Pembroke is right here. For those who know a bit the Ottawa River Valley, here's Shawville. So we're going upstream here, and here, this element is here. So this area here is of interest, and including the caves right here. So our research project involving DFO, l'Institut Maurice Lamontagne, involving, of course, my colleagues at the museum, Katrina Elves, Noël Alfonso, fish experts, the Ministère Faune Forêt Parc Québec, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources with Tim Axton, Carleton University, Colin Rini helping us to understand the benthic habitat, the sand waves on the bottom. We are focusing on these two species, the lake sturgeon and its connection with the hickory knot mussel. And here are Glochidia on the gills of a sturgeon. We are currently examining the DNA of these Glochidia, trying to determine if whether or not they are of the hickory knot species. The life cycle has been demonstrated in the lab in the States, but we've never studied it in Canada. So we're doing a kind of a first here. We are in the coming months, months, determining what are those Glochidia on the gills of the lake sturgeon caught in the Ottawa River, and it would be also a premiere for Canada. Here we have our team here. He's my colleague Noël Alfonso, Katrina Elves, myself. We are holding tight to a non-anesthetized live lake sturgeon where we are looking at the gills. We pry open the gills and we examine carefully if they have Glochidia of any freshwater mussel, which we can then decide what to do with the fish, with the gill filament, in order to extract the DNA. All the fish with no Glochidia are released in nature. It's not very common that you find Glochidia, so most of the fish by far are released in nature. So clearly, the two species that we're focusing on, our belief is that they are key elements. They're really holding some of the keys in order to better preserve the Ottawa River, in order to better conserve the biodiversity that is found, both the fish community and the mussel community. And that connection between these two long-lived species, a lake sturgeon can live 50 years, maybe plus. Tim Haxton could be there to confirm, or Katrina or Noel, but I believe they can live close to 100 years if we give them a chance. So these are both types of, these are both, should I say, long-lived species, and that they are connected is really extraordinary. And that brings me to the next phase or part of this talk, and Jill will take over in a moment. The Gervais 3-island caves, recently purchased by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, right next to Westmead. The town of Westmead would be right here near the red circle. And the caves are in this kind of a set of islands right there, where the Ottawa River comes down, up again, what we call the Westmead Bend, and near in Finlay or Finlay Islands, where we study this vast population of hickory nut mussel and lake sturgeon. Well, the news is that inside those caves live sturgeon and mussels. And Jill, why don't you take over from here, telling us about what the caves are about and how did it really start?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, André. My colleague, Dr. David Sawatsky, actually discovered and started mapping these caves with colleagues back in like 95 or 85 through 99. And just to let you know, this is a tough place to work as a cave diver. It's not going to attract a lot of interest because it's small, it's very high flow, and quite poor visibility. So it is a remarkable job that he did mapping over 10 kilometers of braided and networked passageways in these systems that go underneath Ontario and Quebec and completely underneath the Ottawa River. So next slide, please. Here's just an overlay of the cave maps or cave tunnels themselves. It's fairly shallow, so it's not very far beneath the river. The maximum depth right now is about 10 meters actually. And as you can see on the right of the slide, if we look at the land cover, it's quite forested, very little population in this region, which is nice, so that keeps it somewhat protected. The bright pink triangle you see in the lower right is sort of the easiest place for me to actually access because it's the one place that I can actually drive to. And the blue triangle that you see on the overlay map is where a lot of the mussels are that we're going to show you, although we found that there are mussels everywhere in this system, literally millions. Next slide, please. So another colleague of mine, Dr. Peter Buzzacott from Australia, participated in the Nature Conservancy BioBlitz in 2015 and brought out empty shells. And I think that's what really sparked Andre's interest, was seeing the different species that he brought out, and then also the confirmed report that yes, there are millions of mussels inside this cave. Next slide, please. Again, this will give you a sense of the absolute beauty and topography of the region. It's quite remarkable, and I have to believe that, but not just currently, this was treasured. I think this would have been a very treasured place for anyone that came across it, both as a food source, but also just a different area, because these types of cave systems are not common in Canada. Next slide. The first written accounts that we found are from Sir William Logan, 1845, and he was struck by actually seeing the water boiling up out of the ground in places where there were vortices that were sucking the water underground. I'm actually working with a number of people right now trying to learn a bit more about the traditional knowledge associated with this region, because obviously someone likely guided William Logan to this place, and it would have been a place of such great bounty and sustenance. And I'm learning about some very interesting Algonquin lore about Mishipishu, an underwater serpent that's sort of associated as a balance to thunderbirds. So hopefully I'll have more of the indigenous story as I continue to work with some very generous knowledge keepers about this. Next slide. So in places you'll see water boiling up out of the ground, as you can see on the left side, and that's what we call a resurgence or a spring. And on the right side, we see a siphon, a place where the water is being sucked down into the ground. And you can see the foamy water, sticks, branches. In some cases, we get quite a proliferation of garbage that kind of gets dragged there, especially in the springtime, when there's just a massive turnover of water. Next slide, please. And here's the entrance that I am usually getting started at. This is a resurgence, so the water's coming out of the ground. And when we cave dive, we prefer to dive in resurgences as opposed to siphons, because the current is extremely strong here, and I may have to really fight my way hand over hand to pull my body into the cave system. And that way, when I'm tired, I can just use the current to push me out. So that's one of our sort of golden rules of cave diving. Next slide, please. So it takes quite a lot of equipment, training, and background to cave dive, and even more background and experience to cave dive in such a dangerous location like that. Just to give you a little bit of an idea about the techniques that I use, I'm wearing a dry suit to stay warm, and you know, in the winter time anyway, there's an incredible temperature swing in this cave, obviously, but you know, in the winter time, I'll even have my hands kind of sealed into these gloves that snap onto my suit to keep them dry. And at all times, we're actually running a guideline through the cave system. So there's 10 kilometers of ropes through these systems, tucked a little bit back from the entrance so people don't accidentally come across these guidelines. But this creates a bit of a tactile reference for us. So it's quite common that I'll lose all visibility during the dive. I may be able to see, you know, 30 to 60 centimeters at times. And so to come out of the cave, the guideline is run through the cave system, and I would just put my fingers loosely around the guideline and be able to follow that out as a tactile reference out of the cave. So that's one of the very important safety techniques. Also within the cave, we use navigational markers, little plastic devices like arrows like this that will point the direction to the nearest safe opening. So there's a lot of interesting different bits of equipment that we use in order to pull off a safe cave dive. Next slide. So here's a little panorama of the entrance that I often go into. So I'm going in at the right side near that boat. And the first thing I do is actually swim under a land bridge. And you can see on the left side of the photo, that's a sinkhole already. So that's number one, where daylight can penetrate. So there's many holes like this in the woods that I'll swim under. I'll get a little bit of daylight and then be able to continue on. Next slide. Here's a better sense of what the visibility looks like. And, you know, it's extremely important to note that, like, this is not a place to just go have a look if you're a recreational diver, not even as a cave diver. This is a place you just want to go have a look, because it's, well, first of all, it's private property where these entrances are, and scientific permits are obviously needed as well. But just safety wise, you know, this is an extremely advanced cave that requires a lot of redundant equipment and a high level of training and experience to pull off a safe dive. Next slide. In geographic terms, this is a karst network of joint-controlled conduits, sinkholes, and sumps that extend over 10 kilometers. So it's basically an underground river underneath the Ottawa River, carrying water from the Ottawa River through its system, and it's all limestone. And next slide. If we walk through the forest to some of the different entrances, we'll see piles of mussel shells all over the place. Some that may have been just, you know, naturally blown out of the cave, but some that have been left behind by animals that have consumed those mussels, maybe muskrats, for instance. Next slide. So far to date, we've observed 5 species of mussels in the caves. So 4 of them live, and an additional, the triangle floater, empty shells from that as well. And we hope that this represents a robust community that's continuing to grow. And that's, part of the research that's important. Next slide. As we look at the floor of the cave in places, we see an unbelievable density of life, up to 100, even more individual mussels per square meter. And you can see a lot of little white things there too. Those are sponges. And each shell is covered in its own life. It's like each shell is an ecosystem of its own. So there's so much that we need to study about the system, not just the mussels, not just the fish, but things that are living within the silty substrate, things that are living on the shells of the mussels. Next slide. And here's a picture of one of our beautiful lures. So it's incredible to me. I'm new to mussels from this research, and it's incredible to me that this animal, without an eye or a brain, would be able to develop such a beautiful little lure out of its own flesh with an eye spot. And every one of the lures that we see is different. So to me, it's quite phenomenal to witness it and be very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time to capture this behavior, which is really only happening at one time per year. Next slide. So here's a little video, and this gives you a sense of some of the flow. You'll see all the spots just blowing by, and that was a little mussel sneeze where he's sort of clearing out some of his, or her, sorry, she's clearing out some of her siphons. When there's too much silt, she'll just kind of blow herself clear. And next slide. Some of the other things that we see are a lot of fossils that are very similar to things that we see in the riverbank themselves. So, and on very shallow parts of the Ottawa River. So these fossils are on the walls, they're embedded in the floors, they're even embedded in the ceiling. And as the cave has been eroded over time, these very hard iron rock fossils will fall out of the softer limestone ceiling, land on the floor, and then become their own little ecosystems covered with sponges and other macroinvertebrates too. Next slide. So here's a similar, fossil that's actually still stuck to the ceiling. So I'll find, remains of coral, for instance, that tells us a little bit about the ancient history of this as a seabed. Next slide. And then throughout the cave system, in the complete blackness, any light that you see here is brought by me. We still see fish like this burbot that's coming and going, and smallmouth bass and sturgeon and log perch. And next slide. And here we can see actually some of the thicker guideline. I know I showed you my reel with a thinner guideline, but in some of the highest flow areas of this cave, we put very heavy guidelines so that we could physically pull on them in order to make way. This is a very calm and clear day that you're seeing there. Next slide. And here's some of our mussels, and you can see there's one that's pointed to with a nice curve in it. So sometimes the mussels actually kind of get wedged in the rocks, and I'm not certain, but it appears to me that the current over time has actually bent the growth of the shell. So pretty interesting. Next slide. Okay, and here we are with a plain pocketbook, and notice how clean that shell is, and also notice the little ridges in the shell that can help us to determine how old this is. And let's compare it to the next slide. That's going to show us a mussel that is completely covered with other things growing on it. So you can see all of these filaments and other things. Mussels do disappear in the bottom and re-emerge. And so sometimes we see them quite clean, at other times really covered with life. Next slide. And here we go with a little video, and you can see the mussels actually moving and a lot of these filamentous things that are hanging off of it. And now you can see a little hydra in that red circle. So that's a very interesting living being there. And here we are again, you can get a sense for the velocity of the current inside the cave system. It's quite robust. And here's a little bit of a lure sort of poking out along the top edge there, that little frilly fringe. Next slide. The other thing that I see is I often have bass that are following me into the cave, and they will frequently kind of hover over the bottom and dust is what I call it. And so they're sort of disturbing the substrate. Are they using that to disturb things that they can eat? Probably. Let's look at a little bit of a video of one of our bass friends kind of stirring up the bottom in the next slide.
Jill, if I may add one comment
Mhm.
here.
Yeah.
Let's point the audience, these sponges. The
Mhm.
sponges are everywhere in the picture that you took here. Spectacular freshwater sponge growth on a variety of substrates, on the shells, on the rocks, empty shells,
Mhm.
live shells. It's amazing. And these are filter feeding animals also,
Mhm.
although they feed on very, very tiny microscopic plankton, even smaller particles than what the freshwater mussels can live on. So one of the things that Jill is finding is that these sponges come and go during the seasons, and there are times of the year when it's just extraordinary. So this is a very interesting aspect of the aquatic life of the
Mhm.
caves. So here's the video that you're talking about, Jill. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the fish sort of hovers and stirs up the bottom, and I'm sure he's doing a service for himself and probably also for the mussels and the sponges as well, who are filter feeding. All right, let's look at the next slide. Yeah, so here you can get a sense of the density of those mussels. And in the center there, you've got a plain pocketbook, and you've got lots of sponges and lots of eastern elliptio mussels that are sort of obscured by the sponges. Yeah,
Yeah, the elliptios are here on the right-hand
yeah, there
side.
you go.
The sponges are everywhere. It's an
Mhm.
extraordinary, and also the abundance of filter feeding organisms like sponges and mussels seems to be quite prevalent.
Mhm.
It's quite stunning
Mhm.
to see so many filter feeding organisms.
Yeah.
Next slide, Jill.
Yes, please. We see quite a lot of log perch in the cave, and they're frequently concentrated nearer to the entrances. So I'm not sure if they are going deeper into the cave system all the time. That's something that we hope to learn in the future is how far do some of these fish travel into the cave system. Next one. Here we see a group of them all around a Lampsilus cardium, a plain pocketbook mussel. And next slide. Again, more of the abundance on a pretty clear day in the cave system. And you can see the wall in the back there, the limestone with silt overlain. So the conditions vary quite a bit depending on the flow, the season, and everything else. Next slide. Here we have another smallmouth bass hovering over mussels, and we see quite a lot of these smallmouth bass that are very black, dark in the cave, and not sure if that's a unique adaptation or just part of this local population. Next one. We also see crayfish in the cave systems, and this is a troglazine crayfish. That's not a name for the species. What that is a description of an animal that comes and goes. It's a cave visitor, so it'll come and go from the cave system. It's not uniquely cave adapted because cave adapted. Fully cave adapted crayfish can live an entire life cycle inside the blackness of a cave, but they tend to be eyeless and without pigment. So this one comes and goes. Next slide. And here we have him just sort of actively stirring up the bottom and probably looking for something to eat himself. So kind of cool. And many of them that we are seeing are pale. So that definitely needs some further research as well. Next slide. Okay, and more of our log perch schooling near the entrance of the cave system. And next slide. And here's our log perch coming for a visit with a plain pocketbook mussel. And next slide. Okay, and here you can see beautiful apertures and a pretty nice chunk of sponge there as well. And next slide, we have Eastern elliptios that are all quite clean on this particular day. And next slide, let's look at the hickory nut. Here, I'm just picking up a sample, and even to touch a sample, we need a lot of special permits because this is an endangered species. So just for references, there are times that we're able to touch them and times we can't. And it's all carefully permitted for the protection of the species. Next slide. Okay, so here we have an emerging lure. And what I'll find sometimes if I'm very, very careful as I swim into the cave, I get to see a lure fully extended. But even just my motion may cause that lure to be retracted. And so it is such a special thing to see even part of a lure exposed, and even better when I see the lure actually being manipulated and sort of flicked for a fish. That is really special.
Also, Jill, if I may add,
Mhm.
if you look at the incurrent siphonal aperture right here, this is the outflow, the inflow goes through here. So you can see the gill filaments right here. If you look at the inside, we can see the inner gill filaments of the freshwater mussel, in this case, the female, where the water comes in and the food particles are captured by the thousands of, thin gill filaments. And then the water, once filtered, is coming out via the excurrent aperture. Here you can see this lure that Jill, you've been talking about with the eye spot, which is typically a black dot of different shapes, sometimes round, sometimes irregular, with a kind of a white iris around it. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And this is some other life. This is actually the feeding net of caddisfly larvae. So these insects begin their life underwater, and they create this little mucus net that they hang everywhere in the cave from time to time. So on the walls, on the ceiling, or as you can see on my guideline. So it almost looks like old socks that they just laid on the guideline that will be flapping in the breeze and collecting things for the caddisfly larvae to feed on. And then the next slide, here's my line actually covered with autumn leaves. So in the fall, when all the leaves come off the trees, they end up getting sucked into the cave system. And this is probably a big source of nutrient for the entire ecosystem within the cave. And in the moment when all of the leaves are most dramatically falling from the trees, they'll be tumbling through the cave system in the water column, but then also getting caught up in the mussel beds and on my line as well. So let me pass this back to André to wrap up some of our conclusions before we have some questions and answers.
So you've seen pictures and videos that Jill took in the caves showing these different species. So here are some good looking images. This one might be slightly out of focus, but this is the triangle floater, the empty shell of which we were finding in the caves. The black sand shell, so far only fresh empty shells. We have yet to find live individuals, but we know that they're present because the outflow of the caves bring some of these fresh shells out. The hickory nut, we find live individuals, evidence that they are present. Lake sturgeon has been observed by David Sawatsky in the past, so we know that these two species, the hickory nut and the lake sturgeon, do occur in the caves. Lamp mussels, one shell, mostly the plain pocketbook and the Estoneleptio. So by order of abundance here, the abundant ones, abundant species, and the less common or the more rare or occasional species are here. The good news that Jill and I have to give in the sense is that in that part of the Ottawa River, in that region, there are no zebra mussels. And that's a good news. And it could be due to, we think it's due to the chemistry of the water being nutrient poor, calcium poor. So very low calcium content or calcium carbonate, which the zebra mussel requires in order to reproduce. So it's a good thing. Our native mussels are easily able to live in these kind of soft water of the Canadian Shield, but the zebra mussel is not. So that's a great news. So far, so good. It is in some adjacent lakes on the Ontario side near Pembroke, but not in the Ottawa River proper. So to wrap up the taxa or the biodiversity, the freshwater biodiversity that we have observed in the caves, thanks to Jill's footages, photos, and her own eyes. Here we are, freshwater mussel, millions of them. There's no doubt about it. They are in a lot of cranny corners and and elbows of the caves and in sedimentation areas, sometimes also on bedrock with very little silt, surprisingly, and you wonder how they make a living on mostly rocks, but sometimes it's quite thicker in terms of silt. Fishes, sturgeon, pike, bass, log perch, burbot, catfish, other species also are present. More research will be required to study them with trail cameras, trap cameras, trapping, the footages that Jill will take in the coming years. Sponges, we think it is Spongilla lacustris, extraordinary abundance, white in color, not green like you see in open water, no pigments. Benthic, small crustaceans, copepods, amphipods, we have yet to tap into this world of small epibenthic or these kind of a tiny crustacean organisms living on the bottom of the river, inside the caves. Larval insects, lots of chironomids, lots of caddisfly, which may, in fact, the caddisfly may shred all those leaves or much of the leaves, leaf litter that Jill was talking about as a food source. And then the caddisfly would be eaten by, of course, the regular insect eaters, the fishes. Oligochaetes, crayfishes, cnidarians, hydra. We saw hydra on the shells of a few of the images that Jill took. Gastropods, viviparids. So in red are, by the way, the mobile species, fishes, crustaceans, larval insects, crayfishes, gastropods. And in black, the sessile species, the species that don't really move much once they're inside the cave. Mussels, sponges, oligochaetes, cnidarian, or hydra. So basically, this is the beginning of our inventory of life forms living in the caves. Important to mention, these are some elements that we need to mention. This 142-kilometer segment of the Ottawa River, it truly includes habitats that are in need of protection. It's not only where we found the largest population of the hickory nut mussel in Canada so far until now, but it's also where the caves are located. It's important to mention that this 142-kilometer between Deep River and slightly upstream from there, all the way down towards Shawville, this 140-something kilometers of river is exhibiting a near natural free flow. There are no hydro dams in that stretch. The sturgeon is very abundant. I mean, relatively speaking, compared to other segments of the Ottawa River, the studies by our colleague Tim Haxton and their team at OMNR in Pembroke and also in Peterborough show that the lake sturgeon is doing rather well in that stretch. They are juvenile sturgeon, and the mussels, of course, are abundant. We've known that in the open water, extraordinary abundance of mussels, sometimes up to 200 mussels per square meter. In the caves, also up to 100 plus mussels per square meter in the caves. The lack of zebra mussel in the main stem where we're studying in that stretch of river is really a good news. The habitats are unique. They are large fluvial dunes. We have a colleague at the University of Ottawa, Colin Rennie. He's helping us to understand the process of these dunes, these large sand waves on the bottom where the hickory nut is abundant. Low human impact in general terms, natural landscape. And of course, like we mentioned earlier, like Jill has talked about, this is Canada's longest known underwater cave network, and it's right here, just upstream of Ottawa. It's extraordinary. At some point, I was hesitant to add this slide. I said, Jill, do you want us to show a tire like this? So the human presence is a reality. Of course, a tire can drift, debris like to the right-hand side, debris of an old dock or something, especially where you've got a siphon at the entrance of a cave. This is the reality. Of course, we can do better to clean up the shore, and the Ottawa River Keeper is actively participating in this chore. But by and large, the area where we're studying these caves, the area that I'm talking about, this 142-kilometer of river between upstream of Deep River and all the way to Shawville, with Pembroke, Westmeath in the middle, and the caves and Finlay Islands, it's rather pristine compared to other places. I will wrap up here by asking questions that we have yet to find answers. What is the diversity of union mussels, of freshwater mussels in the caves, of fishes and other invertebrates? We're just starting to scratch the surface. What's the effect of substrate quality on the mussel distribution inside the cave network? The color morphology of the flesh of mussel, of the lures, as you go deeper into the caves, as you move in, what are the color morphs that we see? Glochidia dispersal, in and out. How often do fish bring in the larvae or the glochidia of the mussel to enhance population of mussels, or are they self-recruiting within the cave, and everything happens within the cave itself without having the fish or the mussels larvae to go out? So 10 kilometers is a long stretch. Things can happen way deep in there, in the cave system. Biodiversity hotspots. Is it a biodiversity hotspot? It is possible that we are, examining a kind of a unique habitat in the sense of how things work, the distribution, the abundance, the flow, the siltation, the filter feeding. It may be a unique place compared to the rest, with the open water habitats of the Ottawa in the area. Food supply. What's the importance of leaf litter? We don't know. It could be important. And Jill, why don't you mention a few words about this one?
Yeah, just another reminder that this is quite a dangerous place, and that cave diving is really only meant for people with the right equipment, training, and background. So please don't go here. You can paddle or get out on the river and see some of the openings from a boat, but please don't go cave diving in this place.
Yeah, it is a dangerous place to work, especially near siphons and near where the water comes under the rocks. And like Jill mentioned, a very dangerous place even for cave divers. This is not the ordinary cave diving, and I'm not trained myself to go in. And Jill is the eyes of this project, and we're lucky to have her. At the same time, it is not for everybody. Take home messages. We are now looking at the longest underwater cave network in the country. We have evidence of abundance of mussels and fishes roaming across the cave network. And I think it's important to think about designating this special 142-kilometer stretch of the Ottawa River without hydro dam, with the caves in the middle, with a very high abundance of hickory nut in that area, abundance of lake sturgeon, with a conservation status, with the designation, so that for future generation, for the sake of protecting this portion of the Ottawa River, we're protecting probably the cream of the cream, with near natural flow, no dams, and all the things we've been talking about in terms of aquatic life in that area. To wrap up, in terms of acknowledgements, it's important to mention the following people: Robert McLennan, David Sawatsky, Peter Bizekot, Cheryl Spotswood, Daniel Gervais, Alfonso Katrina Ilves, Sarah Lidis. All these people have helped us to put together this talk, but also find material, the logistic, identification of species. Robert is helping Jill a lot, I know that. Of course, the portion of the project involving the hickory nut, the lake sturgeon survey in the open water, thanks to DFO funding at Institut Maurice Lamontagne, local volunteers, Vin Gervais, Doug Lapointe, Ron Graham, and others. Nature Conservancy of Canada allows Jill and I to study the caves, to get in, to touch species or collect, and we need to, of course, fit in the right permits. And Jill mentioned the National Paleogeographical Society as an agency with whom she collaborates. I thank you for your patience, and we would be happy to answer questions.
Wow, what a fascinating presentation. As predicted, we thought there would be so much substance that it would take us near to the end of the hour. And unfortunately, we do have a hard stop at the hour. So we won't get to too many questions, if any, but I want to say a heartfelt thank you to both André and Jill for that fascinating presentation. I know that Jill, your book is called Into the Planet, and you've both just taken us right into the river in a whole new way that so many people are not able to access. We were able to do it without dry suits, without wetsuits, without all that gear, from the comfort of our homes. So thank you for that really close up and personal view. I mean, the mussels, the hydra, the sponges, thinking about the glochidia attaching to the fish gills, it's a different kind of viewpoint of what's happening under the surface of the river. So thank you so much. There are many, many questions coming in. I'd encourage, there still is time to capture those questions. If you put them into the Q&A, using the Q&A button instead of the chat. That's just an easier way for us to filter them. Oh, filter with mussels. I didn't even mean to make the pun. But let me take a moment to give a little plug for what else is coming up from Ottawa Riverkeeper. So we're a charitable organization that does science, education, and advocacy work around the whole of the Ottawa River watershed. And we have a really unique role there, a critical role, because there's so many different jurisdictions. And it's important to see that we have collaboration and that the attention is paid to the health of the Ottawa River. Next week, we have another webinar coming up, this time on road salt. And it'll be on March 17th at noon. Our scientist, Matt Fife, will be giving an update on our project monitoring these impacts. And the talk is even going to include tips and tricks on reducing your own road salt usage, as well as the training program that we've launched to try to reduce road salt use for contractors and large companies in the Ottawa area. So that's a really fascinating one. And then later that evening on the 17th, we'll be hosting an online gathering for youth interested in water protection. So check out our website to learn more. So Jill and André, there are so many questions coming in that I wonder if there are some resources you'd be willing to put into the chat that would point people to more information on these topics.
Well, I was going to suggest that if there's any questions specifically about cave diving, you can reach out to me at Into the Planet. And maybe if there are more other technical questions, perhaps André and I could answer those and post them on your blog as a follow-up. Would that work? Then we can answer everything. If you guys just copy those questions, we'll.
We could do that. We could so that people, people could see the variety of questions that may have arisen. Cave questions, diving questions, species questions, biodiversity questions, hydrology. So yeah, Jill, that's a good idea.
Great.
If you're agreeable, Laura.
I am, and all of those topics are definitely coming in as questions. You piqued some interest, so fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, so stay tuned for a blog, and we'll post some more pictures with that too as a tease.
Wonderful. Yes, the pictures and the videos have been fantastic.
Thank you for this opportunity, Laura.
Yes, thank you both. On behalf of Ottawa Riverkeeper, we're so thrilled, and you're getting lots of great comments coming in the chat about people's experience today. Maybe I'll ask just one of the questions that have come up. So it's so fascinating to see that this is Canada's longest known underwater cave network. One question that came in to Jill is, you have done cave diving all over the world. How does the diversity and novelty of what you found in this area over the last few years compare?
I've never seen anything like this, and that's why I'm so interested and thrilled to be working with André to further fully describe what we're seeing, because I have never seen a place like this. So it's special. It needs protecting.
Good answer for the only question we had time to ask. Okay. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate it. Thank you both. And we look forward to that blog post.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.